Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is Sacagawea, probably the only American founder born in modern-day Idaho. Now real quick, first of all, I know a lot of people don't consider Sacagawea an American founder, but she was an important part of the Corps of Discovery and the Lewis and Clark expedition, which most certainly was part of the American founding. So that's why I feel like we should talk about her here. Additionally, her spelling of her name. I spell it with a G. That's been the most common way to spell it. It can be spelled with a J or a K. I am pronouncing it with a J sound, however. I do this because, first of all, that pronunciation has become more common, and because that's the way the Shusho Nation, where she was born, probably pronounced it. So, with that out of the way, Sacagawea was about 12 years old, living in the northwest of what is now the United States, when the Hidatsa Nation came through with a raid. They killed a bunch of people, and they took some young women as hostages. Sacagawea lived with these people for about 4 years before she was either sold or lost in a bet to a gentleman named Toussaint Charbonneau. Now, Charbonneau was a French-Canadian fur trapper who was one of the first white people of European descent to make their way out to this part of the world. He's out there, he buys or wins Sacagawea and makes her his wife. Interestingly enough, she was just 16 years old, and Toussaint had already had a woman named Otter Woman who was in her late teens. That was already his wife. He wasn't the best guy. In fact, earlier in life, he was in Manitoba, Canada, and was stabbed by a woman whose daughter he was sexually assaulting. So not everyone really liked this guy, and it's important to set that up for later in the story, because they're out there in North Dakota when all of a sudden some Americans show up. And that was a little bit surprising. And these Americans were the Corps of Discovery, better known as the Lewis and Clark expedition. Lewis and Clark show up, they're surprised to see a white guy there too, and they say, "Hey, you speak all these languages?" And he says, "Oui." And they say, "Can we hire you to help us?" Now at this point, it's November, and they're about to go into their winter quarters, and they invite Toussaint and Sacagawea and Otter Woman into their winter quarters. They do end up hiring them to come along for the trip to help them translate and interpret with other Native American nations. Now, by the time they meet Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea is already very well pregnant, and it's that February the following year, just before they leave winter quarters and continue their adventure, that she has a baby, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. And Jean-Baptiste ends up becoming a celebrity of his own right because he was the baby from the adventure, and Sacagawea ends up carrying him on her back for the entirety of the trip. Now, I do want to note that they hire them right before they leave to go out on the adventure. There's a little bit of a anger with Toussaint Charbonneau, and he storms off. And then he comes back and says, "You know what? Can you hire me again? I want to come." So he ends up being a pain for them the entire trip. They're on a boat, and he doesn't know how to row a boat, basically. Fortunately, Sacagawea saves a bunch of the papers he almost lost. She becomes a real asset on this trip. Now, we often think of Sacagawea as a guide, and while there were certainly moments where she did help determine the way, she... most notably, coming back from the Pacific Ocean, crossing the Rocky Mountains, she found a very important pass to get them across. But she was really hired on to be a translator or interpreter so that they could communicate with these Native American nations that the Americans had never come in contact with. She does a fabulous job and ends up becoming kind of a role model for many women in the centuries that follow. But what's really fascinating is they come back and she kind of disappears from the record. Really, all we know about her life is what William Clark tells us from we know a lot about what she did on the travels, including being really excited to see a monstrous fish, aka a beast whale, on the Pacific Ocean. And also, I want to note, much like York, William Clark's slave who came on the trip, Sacagawea was also given an equal vote to everyone else. It's one of the reasons she became important in the women's suffrage movement. There's this one several year journey of equality that happens where both a Native American woman and an enslaved person are able to have an equal vote with all the white men there. This includes when they made a decision where to camp when they arrived on the Pacific Ocean. Now, as I was saying, they come back, they end up William Clark especially really takes to Jean-Baptiste Coburneau, her baby, and tries to get them to say, he's like, hey, send the baby with me. I can give it a real education. And they don't do it at first, but eventually, I believe it was in 1809, by this point, Sacagawea has 2 children, and they are both put in the care of William Clark in St. Louis and given a more formal education as we would understand it today. And this is kind of where Sacagawea disappears. She goes back west with her husband. They travel around for a while, doing some fur hunting, going back to other nations and living in North Dakota for a while. And then word arrives that she passes away in about 1812 from some kind of fever. Excuse me. We're not really sure of the disease that killed her, but she does pass away. As I said, her son goes on to have kind of a famous life. Excuse me. Her son has a little bit of a famous life, but Sacagawea, while she passes away then, there's also this other story about how she ends up going down south and divorces her husband and marries into the Comanche tribe. Now, this is hard to verify, though there are certain Native American traditions of people from the Comanche tribe who do believe this. So Sacagawea either passes away at 26 years old or at 96 years old. Or 95 years old. So there's about a 70-year difference in how old she may have been. So one of the fascinating things about Sacagawea is exactly how little we know about her, considering how famous she is. She's one of those names that I'm sure you saw on the thumbnail and said, I know who that is. But I'm sure you didn't know all that about her. I could get more into the details of the trip itself, but I think what's really fascinating about Sacagawea is what we don't know about her. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a favor and hit like so more people can learn about the American Revolution with us. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. I put out videos about the Revolution 7 days a week. I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.